now, and then I'm going to put up the windows we need here. Let's see, you don't have it open. Maybe not. Hang on. I got to open the window first. Here it is. Nope, no, not that. This one. Okay. And before we start exactly, I want to tell you something to read for probably 2 classes from now. And okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. So we're going to do this. This is Haham Fa'ur's notes. So we're going to review the Sughya, not the first part, but parts Bet and Gimal, and then all of his notes. So you have exactly what he's talking about. And yeah, but then I wanted to tell you about this. Have you guys seen, let me see if I can open it. There's a, so someone wrote an article they found in the Geniza from Cairo, a piece that was of the Hamaspik Le'obdei Adonai. That's the book written by Harambam's son, Abraham. You may have heard about it. It was first published partly in English by Feldheim, maybe 40 years ago. Then it's published in Hebrew, a Hebrew translation. It was written in Arabic, obviously, but it's not complete. So I don't know how many chapters total, but maybe we had 2/3 of it, some in English, some in Hebrew, some bilingual. The one in Hebrew is bilingual. But there's a part of it that was never known until now. And someone wrote an article exposing or publishing the piece of Rabbi Abraham ben Harambam's section of Hamaspik Le'obdei Adonai, which discusses Ben Hashemashot, what exactly it is. Why is that? I'm trying to find the article now. And why is that so important? Because you're going to see when we study the 2 Sughyot in Masechet Shabbat, chapter 2, that there's a whole confusion because there are 2 paradigms. A later paradigm from the Emoraim in Babel, in particular Yeshivat Pumbedita, 4th generation, where Ben Hashemashot begins at sunset and ends at 3/4 of a meal after that. The earlier paradigm is that you don't say 3/4 of a meal, but you just say Seta Kochavim. And even before that, also from the school of Shemuel, is a paradigm where Kochab Echad Yom, Shenayim Ben Hashemashot, Shelosh Halayla. So Ben Hashemashot really only exists between the 2nd star being visible and the 3rd star, which is much shorter than Shelosh Ribi'ar Mil. Rabbi Yosef Kafeh, you know who he is? He's the Yemenite grandson of Rabbi Yahya Kafeh, who they call Mori HaYoshish. He's the one who wrote the Machon Mishnat Harambam commentary on the Mishneh Torah. It's the red volumes printed by the folks in Kiryat Ono. He has a whole pilpul based on that earlier paradigm that really Shekiah is not at sunset, but it's at the beginning of Seta Kochavim, at the 2nd star. And he created a whole confusion. And I don't think he ever would have gone there if it wasn't for the fact that the yeshiva world cares so much about Rabbeinu Tam. And I met many Sephardim from Mexico and Halabi, forgetting the Turquinos who are, you know, medio y medio anyway, to begin with, as far as tradition goes. I'm a Turk, so I can say that. I know who they are. I know what happened to every Turkish community in North and South America. Not a good end. Okay, just as a side point, my family is the Levi, Moshkatel, and De Funes. I'm the only one in my generation who married a Sephardi. The only one. One of my cousins married half Sephardi, half not Sephardi, but they're kind of assimilated to Kiruv movements. Everybody else married Reform, Ashkenazi, or Goyim. So I know what happened to the Turks. So I'm not talking about the Turks. I'm talking about the Halabi who go to Knis every Shabbat. But I don't know why, in South America and in Mexico, the Halabi tend to veer to black hat. I don't know why or how that happened, but that happened. So maybe 70% believe in Rabbeinu Tam. And I have women who are cousins of my wife who we finish Shabbat, we say Havdalah on Saturday night, and they sit there. And I say, what are you doing? Oh, Rabbeinu Tam. Like, as we say in Ladino, ande parande. What do you know about Rabbeinu Tam? Did you ever study the Tosafot? Do you know one single Sughya? Or you heard from someone who heard what we call in English quaternary hearsay. Hearsay, bet, 4 generations. They think that Rabbeinu Tam is a thing. So it's very important for us. We're trying to educate as much as we can the next generations and our daughters-in-law and our grandchildren what Ben Hashem Ashot really is, because it makes a big difference for milah, for melacha, for all kinds of things. When you can light the Nerot Hanukkah. So you all know you can't light the Nerot Hanukkah beyond sunset plus 35 minutes, right? That's about it. The Yemenites know that, the Rif says it, Harambam says it, but nobody wants to hear it. So, but if you believe in Rabbeinu Tam, you can never light the Nerot Hanukkah bismanaha. So how does that work? We erase a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, one of the 7, because we have a hokey theory that comes from the Holy Roman Empire, France and Germany in the 11th and 12th centuries, who had no tradition from the Geonim. I always found it very annoying. So it's important that we understand what exactly Ben Hashem Ashot is, when it starts. And yes, in the early generations of the Amoraim even, it was not fixed because it's a din mufla. Moshe Rabbeinu never heard of Ben Hashem Ashot. He never heard of Set HaKochavim, never heard of it. Me'arev ad arev tishbetu shabbat techem is a direct pasuk from the Torah. From sunset to sunset, that's Kippurim and Shabbat and Yom Tov and everything else. Arev is the cognate of gharab in Arabic, which means sunset. Sheki'ah, that's all it means. That's why maghrib means the direction where the sun sets. That's all. So I'm looking for this now, but I may not find it. There is an article about, oh, here it is. Okay, so let me open this. And I'm going to put it in the chat too. So I want you to study this before next time. So let me switch the window. Let me see if I can switch it on the fly. No. Okay, so I want to show you this now. I want you to all to read it in the next 2 weeks. So this, have you ever seen this before?
No.
Okay, so here is this guy. It deals with the Yehuda Zibeld. He's Israeli. He's in a kollel, obviously, from Ponovich in Bnei Berak, which I'm not a big fan of for obvious reasons. But once in a while, one of those guys studies something from the Geniza. And the reason he wrote it, if you look in his first 2 pages, because all the Aharonim have a million disputes as to when Ben Hashem Ashot begins and when it ends. That's really his motive. But Milita Agab Orhe Hamashmi'a Lan, as part of his interest in curing the Machlokot of the Aharonim, he gives us the exact translation from the Geniza of a piece of Hamaspik Le'odei Adonai, which was never known before. Here's his translation. If anybody knows Arabic, here's the original right here. This is Arabic. I'm going to put it in the chat. I want you to study this before we start the 2 Sugyot in Ben Hashem Ashot. And I'm going to put it in the chat right now so I don't forget. This is, okay, here we go. And so that's very important. So now. Okay, let me find it again. So this is a very beneficial article for all of us. And I'm very glad he did it. I just put it in the chat, the one that says Talmud classes with Hacham Halewa. That's where I put it. And now we're back in business. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to here. And I want to go to Hacham Faur's notes. And that's what we're going to study today. And then if we finish it, we'll start the next one. I also want you to be aware of something very important. So you all know the last Mishnah in chapter 1 of Berakhoth, and we recited in the Hallel, right? Amar lahem Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Hare ani kiben 70 shana velo zachiti shete'amer yesiat Mitzrayim balelot. So when did Elazar ben Azariah live? He was a contemporary of whom? Rabban Gamliel II. So you should all, it's really good to memorize, and I did this 40 years ago, the Hakdamat of Mishneh Torah. But if you look in the Hakdamat of the Mishneh Torah, Harambam lists the 40 generations between Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbeinu V'Rab Asher. We Sephardim have always been very careful about knowing the Shalshelet HaKabbalah. We never say, oh, Chazal say. That's nonsense to us. That's a buzzword. What do you mean? Who? Who exactly? Who was his teacher? Who were his students? Where did he live? Where is his Kabbalah coming from? Etc. So Harambam very carefully lays out 40 generations between Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbeinu Rab Asher, to be specific. If you read the book called Sefer HaKabbalah of Abraham ibn Daoud, I hope you've heard of him. He's from Andalusian Spain. He was a contemporary of Yosef ibn Megas. There are 38 generations from Rab Asher to Harambam's teacher's teacher, which is Yosef ibn Megas. If you add 2 more to Maimon and Harambam, Maimon is Harambam's father. He was a student of Yosef ibn Megas and Yeshivat Lucena. You get another 40. Interesting fact. So 40 from Moshe Rabbeinu to Rab Asher, another 40 exactly from Rab Asher to Harambam. So that's important to know. Now, why am I saying that? In the last Mishnah of Masechet Berakhoth, chapter 1, there's a mahloket about whether you recite Perashat Sisit in the Kiryat Shema Shel Arvin, right? What does that tell you? When was the first time anybody had the mitzvah of Kiryat Shema at all? Anybody know?
No.
I'll give you another fact. In Masechet Berakhoth, I think the 2nd chapter, but I'm not sure, there's a mahloka between Rab and Shemuel as to what is the mitzvah of Kiryat Shema. Is it to recite the Perashiot, so says Rab, or is it to recite the Berachot after the Shema, which is in the morning Emet V'Yasib, and at night Emet V'Emunah, number 1, and number 2, Hashkibenu. By the way, by law, there's 2 at night, but the second one ends, and you cannot change the hatima of a beracha shetikinu bo hachamim. The hatima is Baruch Ata Adonai, hamolech bichbodo hay v'kayam, tamid imloch alenu le'olam va'ed. That's the hatima. You cannot change it to Shomeret Amo Yisrael, however wonderful those words may be, even if you think they're more correct, unless you are a Bedin HaGadol, it is absolutely haram to change them. So, of course, I recite the Nosach of Harambam and the Yemenites and the Mahzor Aram Soba and the Geonim, all of which is Hamolech Bichbodo Hay V'Kayam Tamid Imloch Alenu Le'olam Va'ed. That's the Hatima. You can't add a beracha. I don't care if it's Friday night, I don't care if it's Tuesday night, you can't do that. So, but Shemuel says the mitzvah is to say those berachot following the Shema. That's why Harambam tells you if you don't recite the berachot after the Shema, you didn't perform the mitzvah, tikunaha. Okay? If there's a mahloket in the first generation of Emoraim between Rab and Shemuel as to what the content of the Kiryat Shema is, and another fact, the reason we start the whole Mishnayot, Me'ematai Korin and Shema Be'arim, is a kind of a zecher for Rabbi Akiva on the day he was killed by the Romans. And Hacham Fa'ur explains this in Horizontal Society. You can go find it. Why did Rabbeinu HaKadosh start the Mishnayot with Kiryat Shema? Because of Rabbi Akiva. And that famous dirasha that he didn't know what it meant, Bechol Me'odecha, until he was being killed, burned alive, scraped alive with burning iron, scraping his flesh off because they made an example of him. He was 80-some years old. Imagine an 80-some-year-old man being tortured. And what does he talk about? He talks about now he knows what it means to say Adonai Echad. Okay, fine. If there was no Kiryat Shema fixed until, I don't know, Rabbi Akiva, or until Ketikunaha, Rab and Shemuel, this mitzvah that we're talking about is very late. And so I don't think this whole notion of when Set HaKochabim arises really mattered until we made Kiryat Shema a mitzvah. So what does it mean that the Chachamim could add a mitzvah? They didn't really add. What they did was extend. So you've all heard, and this is in the end of Masechet Makot, also from Emoraim. There is no Tanaitic source whatsoever as to how many mitzvot there are. You've all heard that there's 613 mitzvot. That's true. But that number is not forever. That's a snapshot in time. That's very important. Most of the Jewish world does not know about Dinim Muflaim, as you know. I wouldn't know if it wasn't for Hacham Fa'ur. He's the first person, if you've heard some of his recordings, he's the first person in maybe 800 years who asked the question, what does Harambam mean when he says the word Dinim Muflaim? And however wonderful the Hachamim Sephardim were, I don't know of any who knew about it except for one. Maybe others knew, his students, his teacher, I don't know. But there's one who knew for sure because he published about it in a book, but he didn't say this is Dinim Muflaim. He said this is Divrei Sofrim. He's explaining to you what Divrei Sofrim is. His name is Rabbi Yitzhak Bechar David. He wrote a book, I forgot what it's called, but at the end of it, there's essays. One of the essays is Divrei Sofrim. He lived in Istanbul, maybe in 1600, maybe in 1700, something like this. Yitzhak Bechar David. Today we would call him Isaac Bihar. He's the only person I know who ever understood kind of Dinim Muflaim, and then Fa'ur comes and spends his whole life talking about it. So what does it mean to extend the mitzvah? So you've all heard, if you studied the Sefer HaMitzvot, which is in Arabic, Harambam opens the Sefer HaMitzvot after the 14 chapters of introduction. Al-Mitzvah al-Awali hu ar-Rububiyyah. The first mitzvah, al-Mitzvah al-Awali, awal means first in Arabic, who is ar-Rububiyyah, what Fa'ur calls dominus, or accepting the sovereignty of God. Not believing in God, that's nonsense. If you don't believe in God, who's speaking to you? If you don't believe in God, like you have to believe in me to know I'm talking to you. If you don't accept that I exist and that maybe I'm just a bot made by ChatGPT, so then there's no reason to have this discussion. So if we stood at Sinai, obviously we know God exists and we have to believe in him, whatever that means. Belief in that sense is a Western term. And it doesn't mean much. But if I say this God of Sinai is my boss, I have to listen to him. Even if the local boss, the king, the president, the government, whatever, says A, and Borei Olam says B, I have to do B. And sometimes, in a very small set of cases, I have to let the governor kill me if I refuse. Okay, that's Yared al Ya'or. It's a very small minority, but it exists. That means I accept the sovereignty of God. So Rububiyyah, that God is my Rub, is my master, right? So al-Mitzvah al-Awali hu ar-Rububiyyah. That's the first mitzvah. Fine. How do you express that? Well, if there's a Bet HaMikdash, when the sovereign calls you, summons you by blowing a shofar, you show up. That's Yom Teruah. That's what Rosh Hashanah was always about. Yimei Olam Uchshanim Kadmoniyot, from the beginning of since Sinai. That's what Yom Teruah is, right? Yom HaZikaron does not mean the day in which you remember. That's a later pirush because there's no more temple. Does anybody know what it means lehazkir in Hebrew? Shoresh zayin chaf resh, but the hif'il. Any idea? So, yes?
To pronounce?
No. Elle barechem ve'elle basusim va'anachnu b'shem Adonai Elohenu nazkir. What does that mean? So these folks, means some goyim, big empire, barechem, they come with chariots. The tank of antiquity was a rechem. Egypt was known as having a secret technology of how you make the best rechavim. Fine. Ve'elle basusim. Some empires are masters at cavalry, horse soldiers, like Mongolia, where they used to know how to ride horses at the same time they could walk from 3 years old. And certain empires were known for having horses, Egypt also. Va'anachnu, we don't organize ourselves by these things because we as Israelites, we had technology, but we didn't have the scale and scope of technology that the huge empires did. Va'anachnu, but we, in opposition, B'Shem Adonai Elohenu, under the name of God, our master, that's Rebubiyah, right? Nazkir, we assemble. Lehazkir means assemble. So Yom HaZikaron means you assemble at the temple. Zichron Teruah. So the pasuk says Zichron Teruah Mikra Kodesh. It's a assembly based on a Teruah, based on a summons from the temple. And that summons is communicated to you by the sound of the shofar. That's what it is. Has nothing to do with God remembering. That's all late, right? And why do you assemble? Because God is your sovereign. If he calls you to assembly, you have to show up. Mikra Kodesh means the call of the Kodesh, which is the sanctuary. Those two terms are parallel. That's hakbala, they say in modern Hebrew, which is two phrases in a pasuk mean the same thing, expressed in different words. Zichron, Teruah, Mikra Kodesh. Okay, so when you had the temple, that's how you expressed Rebubiyah, and some other ways also, but fine. With no temple, how do you express it? So the Chachamim invented an extension that anybody could do any place they are. That's Kiryat Shema, Shel Arvin, V'Shel Shachrin. That's all. So it wasn't fixed what the Kiryat Shema is. What do you say exactly? What are you koreh? Wasn't known until the Sughya in Berakhoth decided between Rab and Shemuel. They decided the position of Rab, but it's a din mufla. Yes, the three pirashiot. That's the mitzvah. There's a rabbinic addition to recite the Berakhoth, and that's called Kiryat Shema Tikunnaha. But the mitzvah deoraita is the pirashiot. Fine. Second machloket. What are the pirashiot? We don't know until Ben Zoma, until Elazar ben Azariah became the head of the Sanhedrin, because they deposed Rabban Gamliel II, if you know the story. And then once Elazar ben Azariah was the Rosh Sanhedrin, he allowed the vote on this derasha of Ben Zoma, and we now have the three pirashiot at night. That was the end of that. We still didn't know whether those Perashiot are the Deoraita or the Deoraita is the Berakhoth until Rab and Shemuel and the Sughya, which came after them, which decided the Mahloket. Because those are two separate yeshivot, right? We have Nehar De'ah saying Nehar De'ah saying Berakhoth, Surah, which is Rab saying Perashiot, and a later Beit Din decides. So I think this whole Sughya we're studying now is late, because there's nothing to talk about until we know what Kiryat Shema is, right? That's why we have this now. And at the time we have it, we are already dealing with people who are either from Babylonia or who came back from Babylonia to Eretz Israel with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they know the idea Seta Kochavim. Nobody else knows that idea prior to Shivat Zion. And maybe nobody cared about it that much until after the temple was destroyed. And we started to say, okay, how do we deal with the end of day? Because nobody thinks in terms of Shekiah anymore. That's an ancient Israel idea, which our people simply don't relate to, neither in Babel, where most of us live, or in the minority in Palestine, Roman Palestine, where the minority lives, but we want Eretz Israel to be the source of law. So that's why this Sughya is here. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Rabbeinu HaKadosh began the Mishnah with the story of Rabbi Akiva, which is obviously about 50 years after the Horban. The Horban was in 68, the Hadrianic persecution in 118, and then the story of Rabbi Akiva comes from the Hadrianic persecution. That's named after the Emperor Hadrian, Adrianos Caesar, who wanted to wipe out the practice of mitzvot, right? And that was their intent from the time of the Horban, but they waited, and Chacham Faur explains all this in the Horizontal Society. So now I want to review the second part of the Sughya.
Chacham, the discussion of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel about Beshokbecha Ubkumecha,
Yes.
when is that? Because it's the schools.
So they are after the Horban also. Hillel and Shammai were during the Bet HaMikdash, but Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai are afterwards. When exactly? 2-3 generations afterwards, I believe. So it's after Rabbi Akiva. Maybe it's contemporary. I don't know. That's a very good question. It's probably contemporary to Rabbi Akiva, but they were definitely, those schools existed in the times of the persecutions in 118, and they're prior to the Mishnah, which first came out in 180. So Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and I want to close that thought. I told you about 15 minutes ago about the Shalshelet HaKabbalah. So let me just review it, but you should review it in the Mishneh Torah. You have Hillel. Then you have his son called Rabban Shimon. We don't know that much about him. But then his son, who's the grandson of Hillel HaNasi, is Rabban Gamliel the first. We know him as Rabban Gamliel HaZaken. Okay? Then his son is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the first. So you have, if we start with Hillel, let's call that the 0 generation, the starting generation. Rabban Shimon 1. Rabban Gamliel HaZaken 2. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the first 3. Rabban Gamliel de Yavne 4. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the second, who's the son of Rabban Gamliel number 2, who's Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, right? So that's the 5th generation after Hillel. And he had the fight with Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Natan. Remember that whole story in I call it the Al-Qasim controversy. They tried to depose him, remember? And then there's a whole story in Horayot. That's a whole different story. His son is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So he's the 7th generation after Hillel, or if you count Hillel, number 8, right? So that's the line of Hillel. That's important to know. And I don't remember why I mentioned that before, but I wanted to close that loop. So he's the 8th descendant of Hillel HaZaken, is Rabbeinu HaKadosh. He was born in 25 years before 180, when he produced the Mahadora Kama of the Mishnayot, which would put him at 155. So there was the Hadrianic persecution, then the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was between the years of 131 and 135 AD. Finally, there was Shamsheket after the destruction of Betar, we call Biter, in 135. And about 15 years later, or no, 20 years later, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is born, and his father, who's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel II, raises him from small childhood to be a Talmid Chacham. And of course, they owned as their own hereditary property the office of Nasi, which was paid for by the Roman government. He raises him to be a Nasi, he becomes a Nasi, and he starts the Mishnah project based on the Mishnayot of Rabbi Meir in, I don't know how old he was, but he finishes it for the first time in 180. He's 25 years old. And the second Mahadora was in 210. And there are some differences, and there's sugyot about the differences between the Mahadora Kama of the Mishnayot and the Mahadora Batra of the Mishnayot. The most famous, of course, is the 4th chapter of Mesi'ah. People call it Perek HaZahab. HaZahab Konet HaKesef. By the way, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's not called HaZahab, it's called HaKesef. And the opening line is HaKesef Konet HaZahab. VeHaZahab Eno Konet HaKesef, the exact opposite. The Yerushalmi preserves the earlier Mahadora. The Babli preserves the later Mahadora. How do they reconcile the two, and why the change is the subject of the Sughya and the Babli. Baruch HaNoten Hayim. We should study that one day. Just file it away. That's a very important Sughya. If you don't understand the two Mahadorot of the Mishnah, you will not understand what that Sughya is doing there. So anyhow, Rabbeinu HaKadosh starts the Mishnayot project, and he opens with this about Rabbi Akiva. So now, let's take another look at this. First, let me recite the Mishnah, because I always recite it, even though I've been studying this Sughya for 40 years now. It's always good to recite. What makes us Sephardim is that we first mentally process something with our ears, and only second with our eyes. We don't analyze first. We kind of use our whole conscious and subconscious when we recite. It has an effect on your mind. And that's why the old Hachamim and the last people on earth to preserve this for real are the Halabi, the Shawam, and the Bala, the Yemenites, but they're quickly losing it in Israel. Because in Israel, there's a pressure to be analytical. There's a pressure to be accepted in Bnei Berak. And if you just recite Mishnayot perfectly, they say, oh, but he only knows it by rote. In our world, it's you first, before you go to the Olympics, you have to be a high school athlete. To be a high school athlete, you have to know how to recite Mishnah and Talmud. Then you could study it, but not before. So it's wonderful to master the first level, which is recitation. After that, you can move on to other levels, which is, Garis must come before Gamir, and Gamir comes before Sabir. There's 3 levels. Garis is you know how to recite it, whether you understand it fully or not. Gamir is you know it all, you understand the words. And Sabir is you understand the legal theory behind it. So we always have Garis, Gamir, and Sabir. The yeshiva world ignores Garis. They don't have a tune. We have a tune for the Mishnayot. We're the last people on earth who have it. The Turks have it, but they don't use it except for Bameh Madlikin. The Shawam have almost the exact same tune as I heard in my youth in Turkish Knis. And the Halabi have a less melodious, but same tune. And the Yemenites have one. But almost nobody teaches that in school in Eretz Yisrael. So now, Me'ematai korin et shema be'arvin. Oh, hold on for just 1 minute. My son is here. Yes, please. With the, the cream, this half and half. Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you. All right, my son, Izacher Latob, is going to get me an ahwe. So now, me'ematai korin et shema be'arvin. Misha'asha kohanim nichnasin le'echol bitrumatan. That's the first part of the Mishnah. Now we use the phrase ad sof 3 times, 3 versions. Ad sof ha'ashmoret harishona dibre Rabbi Eliezer v'hachamim omrim ad hasot Rabban Gamliel omer ad sheya'aleh abud hashar. Very good. First part of the Mishnah, no mahloket, it's bistam. Was there ever a mahloket? Absolutely. This Misha'asha Kohanim Nichnasin was not the formulation of Rabbi Meir. How do I know? The next Sughya we're going to study. The second Sughya gives you different versions of Me'ematai. This Mishnah is bistam and makes it appear that there's no mahloket. That's not the case. That's why we have the second Sughya. So anyhow, but in our Sughya, bistam Misha'asha Kohanim Nichnasin le'echol bitrumatan. Okay, but question. We are writing this in 180 and in 210 AD. Why are you talking about a temple that no longer exists? Why are you talking about terumah? Is anybody still tahor that they could even have terumah? No. Some people, yes, but you can't deal with tumat med. So what do you do about that? Problem. That's why if you look in Hilchot Tirumot, Harambam tells you what to do about halah and tirumah. For halah, which is a kind of tirumah, you take just a small piece of the dough and you burn it. And you take a second piece, which is tirumah derabbanan, and you give it to the Kohanim. Believe it or not, in Syria, we still gave this tirumah to the Kohanim. It's a tirumah derabbanan. You may eat it betum'ah. It's fine. It's derabbanan. It's to remember the mitzvah of tirumah. I don't know anybody else on the planet who does that. We used to do it and we still should do it. We had, the Syrians have about 40% Kohanim. And the Talmud tells us that at the destruction of the Beit Rishon, many of the Hachamim went to Syria. That's why we have so many Kohanim. That's why we don't allow converts, because the Kohanim can't be, we want que no sea mishtura en la sangre santa. That's the way we would say it in Ladino. I think you all understand that. So to keep everybody with real yahos, so you never have to worry if you're a Kohen who you're marrying, we don't allow getting. That's just the way it is. I think it helped the Halabi in Brooklyn 1,000,000%. If they didn't have that edict, which everybody complains about, there wouldn't be a yahos to any Syrian family in Brooklyn. And now pretty much, you don't have to worry about it. You really don't. If you're a Kohen, you can marry anybody. Unless for some exception, okay, I get it. But otherwise, you don't have to worry. That's something to be proud of. So anyhow, the halal, we used to either give the dough, or even better, the women would mafrish halal, the halal derabanan, bake the rolls and give those rolls to the Kohanim. So that's that's the way the mitzvah is supposed to be performed. So anyhow, but now in the Mishnayot, there's tumat med everywhere, and there's no para. So you cannot avoid being temeh med, no matter who you are. Even if you're Kohen, once or twice you had relatives who you had to bury, you became temeh med, and whoever you touched is temeh med. There's no other way out of it. It's just impossible. So why are you talking about tirumah? What does tirumah have to do with our real lives? Nothing. So that's the kushya. Amar mor. And here I am I'm going to do the Sughya, the way it existed as a Sughya kifula before the Seboraim added the introduction. We don't need the introduction, we already studied that. But there's a very important point I want to make sure you know about the Sughya itself. Amar mor. Why do you say Amar mor? Because it's bistam. The Mishnah is bistam. So there's nothing else to say. That's how do you quote a Mishnah bistam? Is Amar mor. Amar mor. משעה שהכהנים נכנסים לאכול בתרומתם. Okay. When you hear that, you're supposed to say, yeah, that's a strange way to formulate the law of Kiryat Shema. Why? Because כהנים אימת האח לתרומה משעה צאת הכוכבים. לתנה משעה צאת הכוכבים. So, first thing is, mikdeh is a term of whom? When you see mikdeh, a flashing light should go on in your mind. What is the Sughya telling you? Who says mikdeh? Almost always seboraim. So we had a mavo seborai, and now we have a seboritic term, right? I think this here, mikdeh, till here, that's an insertion of the seboraim. If you go back to the Talmud as it existed in the year 600, which Harambam owned, in the end of his life, he owned a girsa, a manuscript of the Talmud Bavli, complete from the time of 600 AD, where all the Siboritic notes were still in the margin, not in the text. This would have been in the side, okay? I don't think this is in the original Sughya. What does mikdeh mean? It means like, let's see, or let's investigate. It's a Siboritic term. Okay? Therefore, why doesn't the Mishnah say, fine. How do they know this? What do you mean? The whole Sughya, the whole Mishnah is about you're answering with an assertion. How do you know that? How do you know mikdeh? Who told you that? Where is the evidence? There's no evidence. That's why we're asking the question. So this is biasing the reader. Before you even study the question, the Seboraim feed you the answer. That's kind of putting your hand on the scale before you measure the coffee. You know what I mean? So they're already directing you to a certain answer. And that helps us understand what the Sughya is really doing. So here, I think the Sughya was like this originally. Amar mor, sha'a she'akohanim nichnasin, le'echol bitrumata. Fine. Why? Mileta agam orhe kamash mi'a'lan. Why did it do that? And as you, as the reader of the Emoraitic Sughya, are supposed to understand the kushya yourself, right? Why? Why do we need to talk about Tirumah when we're asking kushya about Kiryat Shema? We would say in Talmudic language, I asked about Hatin, Ve'anit bis'orin. Why are you telling me about Tirumah? I asked you about Kiryat Shema. Tirumah is really irrelevant, right? And the Seboraim now are telling you, yeah, we already know the answer. So the Tirumah thing must be for some other reason, right? Okay. That's important. So you need to know the first half of the Sughya, which is here in Surah, the Seboraim are already telling you the answer before you heard the answer, right? So now, that means the answer you're going to hear is not about substance, it's about rhetoric. That's the answer. That's the real answer, right? And I don't think any of the Aharonim understand that. And now we're going to go over what it means exactly. Milleta agab orhe kamash mi'a'lan. When they answered about they're telling you something else. Although ostensibly it's about Tirumah, it's really about something else. And what is that? So we said about Tirumah. When did the Kohanim eat Tirumah? Again, how do you know that? We don't know that. Where is the Sughya about Tirumah that tells you that, right? It's this one. So we don't know about that yet. We're begging the question. The This is the ostensible, the seeming, the first glance reason. It's not the real reason. You are supposed to decode the reason. This is a kind of a remez. And if you can't understand the remez, then you don't understand the sugya. So now, ostensibly, they want to tell you, kapara lame'akeba. Okay, so you need this Mishnah in Berakhoth, which is talking about Kiryat Shema, to tell you that Tiruma, no, that if you're a Kohen and you're a Tabul Yom, and you went to the Tebilah, see, that's what Tabul Yom means, and now it's after sunset, you don't have to make a kapara before you could eat tiruma. In other words, you could eat tiruma after bi'at shimsho. As I showed you in Masechet Nera'im, there's an explicit Mishnah that tells you that. You don't need this Mishnah in Berakhoth to tell you what's explicit implicitly, to tell you what's explicit in Masechet Nera'im, right? And moreover, kapara lame'akeba doesn't tell you when Kohanim eat tiruma. When we say bi'at shimsho me'akebato le'echol bitruma, ve'en kaparato me'akebato le'echol bitruma, that doesn't tell you when that time is. That just tells you bi'at shimsho. And in fact, it uses the old lashon of bi'at hashemesh, which means sunset, right? Everybody knows from the time of Shlomo HaMelech from Kohelet, Bezara Hashemesh Uba Hashemesh. Bi'at Shimsho means sunset. It's the opposite in astronomical terms from Zirihat Hashemesh. Everybody knows that. So Bi'at Shimsho has zero to do with Seta Kochavim. So we're Ke'en telling you we need this Mishnah to talk about Tiruma because Milleta Agab Orhe Kamashmi'a Alan. And what is that Milleta Agab Orhe? What is that secondary piece of information? The Kapara Lame Akeba. Fine, we understand that. We know that from the Mishnayot. But if Kapara Lame Akeba, what is Me'akeb? Bi'at Shimsho. Now, that's why this kaf is here. This kaf says Kiv Tanya. Ditanya means what this baraita says is exactly what I'm trying to show in my point. The Emoraim have a point, and thank you very much. The Emoraim have a point, and you found a baraita to precisely support that point. Wonderful. If it doesn't support it, but it's related, it points in the direction, but it doesn't show absolutely the point, you must say Kid Tanya. The Emoraim were very, very precise. Nobody in any yeshiva knows that. I know this is recorded. I know I'm publishing it on my website, on my YouTube channel. Sorry, but it has to be said. We have to know. When you get an education in so-called Gemara today, you're not getting an education in Gemara. You may hear the words, you may hear a little bit, and I'm not saying this to deprecate anybody, but I'm saying this mostly for you guys and my son who just walked in. If he is going to know Talmud after I'm gone from this planet, I'm leaving a record. Kiv Tanya, these kind of very detailed terminology, nobody knows today. Okay, so now, Kiv Tanya. Kind of pointed to by this baraita, Uba Hashemesh vel Taher, Bi'at Oro me'akebato mile'echol bitruma, ve'en kaparato me'akebato mile'echol bitruma. Now let me just see. Yeah. Actually, I think this is the more, yeah, that's right. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. This is the wrong girsa. So this is the wrong girsa from the printed text. It says bi'at kitanya uba Hashem betaher bi'at oro me'akebato mile'echol bitruma ve'en kaparato me'akebato mile'echol bitruma. Okay. Oh no, let's see. Yeah, okay. I mean, this is the better girsa. This is Haham Faor's mapa. He put, so his point here, and I posted this in the chat so you can have it. This is the mapa he created when he taught us this sugya 20 years ago, okay? He has mapot on most of the sugyot of the Talmud that he studied. The family intends to publish them, but I think it's going to take 5 years plus. So if nothing happens the next 3 years, I'm going to publish the ones I have with my own notes on the sugyot. I have maybe mapot on 200 sugyot. And so you'll have those. The rest of them, the family has. If you first study all of mine, and then when you need more, go to the family. Joey, the grandson, I think that's his going to do his project. Hopefully you can get the rest. So anyhow, he put, this is called filigron. If you ever heard the English word filigree, it means like there's two threads that are completely intertwined in some kind of cloth. He shows you how this particular sughya is in the structure of filigron. Yes, I know it's a sughya mishuleshet, but on top of that, there's another structure called filigron. It's not that common. He found it here. So he goes, F1 is the one thread, F2 is the other thread, and they exactly mirror and echo each other throughout the sugya. I don't know why, but he put the F1 and the F2 to show you the filigron structure on the printed girsa, and then he puts the good girsa on the second page. Why does he do that? He used to make people study the bad girsa to create attention, to realize that it doesn't make sense, and then he would give you the answer in the correct girsa, which he determined. I get that, but we already studied the good girsa, so let's study it again. So now, we all know the real sifra says, Uba hashemesh v'taher, bi'at shimsho me'akebato b'le'echo b'truma, ve'en kaparato me'akebato b'le'echo b'truma. So the Sughya and Surah, who had the sifra, why? Anybody tell me why is it obvious to any Tamil Hacham that in Surah they had the sifra?
You told us there lived a Rab,
Yes, exactly right, Abraham. What's the full name of the sifra? Sifra Deve Rab. And Sifre Deve Rab. Berab means the yeshiva of Rab. Surah Rab, who was from Eretz Israel, moved back to Babel, started the yeshiva in Surah because he didn't want to step on the kavod of Shemuel. The original settlement in Babel was in Nehar De'ah. Shemuel's father, Abuah the Shmuel, you may have heard of him, was a famous dayan in Nehar De'ah. The first knis they ever made in Babel was called Be Kenishta de Shaf V'Yativ. That's a Persian word. Shaf Yativ is a Persian word. But they made a derasha in Aramit about it, that the Shekhinah came from Eretz Israel. The Shaf V'Yativ, it was, Shaf is to meander. Like in Eyob, Mishut Ba'aris, Shaf in Aramit means to meander, like you're hovering, you're moving, you're not settled. Then Yativ, it established itself bin Harde'ah. And they created that knis, the Shaf V'Yativ, with some of the afar and the avanim of the Bet HaMikdash. So for them, that was like a symbol in their mind of the Shekhinah settling, having a place to land in Babel. Rab didn't want to step on the kavod of Shemuel, so he goes to a place where nobody's shomer mitzvot. And he starts a yeshiva, and he succeeded. He created students, and it was a rival yeshiva to that of Nehar De'ah. In the end, Nehar De'ah was destroyed 2 generations later. Rab Yehuda, who was a student of both Rab, and Shemuel starts a new version of Nehar De'ah in the city called Pumbedita. Pumbedita just means the delta. Dita is the same word in English as delta. It was the mouth of a river in Babel. I don't know which river. Probably Nehar Perat, but I'm not sure. So anyhow, those are the two yeshivot, and those are the famous yeshivot which lasted 1,000 years, Surah and Pumbedita. So now, in Surah, of course, they had the Sifra and Sifre. It came from the house of Rab. Rab edited it in Babel. They did not have it in Eretz Israel. They just didn't, because Rab, you had to go to Yeshivat Rab to get it. Right? So now, they had the Sifra, and it said, ובא השמש וטהר, ועד שמשו מעכבתו מלאכו בתרומה, ואין כפרתו מעכבתו מלאכו בתרומה. That's fine. Now, ostensibly, we speak here in the Mishnah about Teruma because we want to tell you, Mileta agab orhe kamashmi'a alam, dechapara la me'akeva. All right, now that's fine. Now, I told you the Masechet Nera'im tells you that explicitly. But is there still a reason to say this in the Mishnah, even Beremez? Yes. And that's what we mean, Mileta agab orhe kamashmi'a alam, in the first or outward, the outward meaning, not the inward meaning, but the outward meaning. What you call in Arabic, the zahar. So Harambam in the Moreh Nebuchim speaks often about the outward meaning, which is the zahar, milashon, to shine, and the inward meaning, it says the batn, like milashon beten, inside. And a Tamil Hacham has to know how to decode, see the outward and understand the inward. That's the chokhmah of what Fa'ur calls all the time decoding, right? Okay. The Sifra, the Derasha was known to the Tanaim, but it wasn't published. Rab publishes the Sifra in Babel. It becomes an authorized barata, right? What are the 4 authorized baratot? Sifra, Sifre, Tosefta, Hilcheta, which means Mishnayot. The Aharon Habib. Those are the 4 collections. A Surba Merabbanan, which means a Talmid Hachamim, but who doesn't have Semicha, must memorize. Now, how do you memorize it if you're an 18-year-old Talmid Hacham or a 20-year-old Talmid Hacham? If the Torah Shebe'al Peh was never written, how do you, as a Surba Merabbanan, memorize it? Every Surba Merabbanan has to hang out at the 5 people who knew all of this by heart with no books. Nonsense. The French and Rashi tell you that the Torah Shebe'al Peh was never written until the year 900, 1000. It doesn't make sense. Yisrael Moshe Hazan, you heard of him. He writes a whole long super commentary in Iyeh Hayam. It's number 187. I've mentioned it many times. Fa'ur mentions it many times. It's one of the keystones to knowing the Andalusian tradition. The Torah Shebe'al Peh was always written, always written, never published until Rabbeinu HaKadosh and then Rab Asher. It was published in writing at a certain time, but it was always written. Otherwise, nobody could memorize. Your assignment, every student, every single one, has to memorize these collections. It's not possible unless they had Girsaot. You can't bother the most Hachamim, the most developed Hachamim of your generation, who may have known it all by heart after working at it. Were you going to hang out in their house and have them keep reciting to you, and then you make a mistake and you come back and they say, no, that doesn't make sense. It's just stupidity. So it's a different class. Why the French were so married to the idea that Torah Shebe'al Peh literally means only orally. That's a whole different story, but it's complete and absolute nonsense. Okay, so now you have the Mishnayot. We're publishing it in the times of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, 180, 210 AD. In the Mishnah, you may want to make a remez to what's in the Sifra, which is not yet published. So you talk in terms of Tirumah, even though it's explicit in Nera'im, maybe in the school of of Tanaim that this Mishnah came for. They didn't have the Nira'im explicitly. Maybe it was also Bir Mizah. So you say, Me'matai korin et shema be'arin, mishah she'akohanim nichnasin le'echol b'trumatan. Why? To make a remez about the Sifra, which is Bi'at shimsho me'akebato le'echol b'trumah, ve'en kaparato me'akebato le'echol b'trumah. So for the very small, statistically small case of Mechusar Kippurim, Hazid, a Kohen, who also happened to be a Zav. Very rare. How many Kohanim have gonorrhea? Hardly any, right? Because Tiyad Adonai Hatoba Alehim, they married Betulot at a young age. Their parents and grandparents and fellow Kohanim made sure that they were not Zanaim. Very, very rare. So, Kohanim don't have gonorrhea. It's very hard to get gonorrhea. If you're a Kohen, you're going to marry a Betulah at 18 to 19 or 20 years old, and your parents are going to make sure you have a business, you know what to do, and you don't need all these problems, right? And some Kohanim felt, well, what if one day the temple comes back and our family could be Kohanim Gedolim? So let's let our children marry Betulot. Why should we do something wrong? So something separate? Why? Yeah, I know. If someone's wife dies and he marries Almana, okay, okay, fine. But mostly not. So in the small case where a Kohen is a Zav, and therefore Mechusar Kippurim, or a leper, also very rare, Misorah, also very rare. But let's say, then we want to encode the halacha that bi'at shimsho me'akebato, but not kaparato. So even though you're Mechusar Kippurim and you did not yet get to the Mikdash to bring your korban, which doesn't even exist now when we're making the Mishnayot 100 years later after Horban, okay? It's all theoretical. We want to encode the Sifra, which says bi'at shimsho me'akebato and kaparato me'akebato. That's fine. Okay. So now, we still didn't teach though Sha'at Tzedek Kochavim. That's why the Seboraim had to inject that in the beginning, like I said before, so you're already biased when you read the Bi'at Shimsho, you think Seta Kochavim. The words don't say that. We are reinterpreting, we're projecting onto the words Bi'at Shimsho, which is the real Girsa of the Sifra, the words Seta Kochavim, and you may not notice it. The astute Tamil Haham, which that's why I'm teaching it this way, is supposed to notice. But wait a minute. They took Bi'at Shimsho and they acted as if it equals Seta Kochavim. It doesn't. And how do I know? Tanya. If it would be Seta Kochavim, it would be Detanya. This Tanya does not teach you Seta Kochavim. It teaches you Bi'at Shimsho. Okay, now. So here's the key point of the Sughya in Surah. Is this, of course, it's in Aramaic, right? So now you're asking this question because of the mikveh. I hope everybody gets that. That's the key to unraveling the sugya. Once we said mikveh, and now you think bi'at shimsho means seta kochavim. Oh, someone's trying to admit oh, here we go. Okay. Once you hear mikveh, you already think bi'at shimsho equals seta kochavim. Now you can ask this question. Bi'at oro is written nowhere. There's no Tanaitic source that says bi'at oro. This is a leap based on mikveh. So we know in Surah that it's a leap. So that's why we're asking. How do you know Uba Hashemish means bi'at oro? And therefore, now the first time, no, it's the second time. So that Sifra, which we quoted in the Baraita, gives us two things. Bi'at Shimsho, this law about Kapara Lame'akeba, and the Pasuk. For the first time, we have a Pasuk that somehow is connected to the law of the Mishnah. Because there's no Pasuk which tells you Seta Kochavim, and there's no Pasuk that answers the question Me'emata. It doesn't exist, right? So, Taher where in the pasuk it says uba hashemesh v'taher. So if you're going to say bi'at shimsho equals bi'at oro, same thing as saying equals seta kochavim, then umay v'taher, the taher in the pasuk must mean bi'at oro, right? Or I mean taher yoma, the second stage of nightfall, which is Achiyat Taher Harakia Min Haor. We call that in Gemara language Bi'at Oro. Okay? Taher Yoma. Dilma Bi'at Shimshohu. Maybe Uba Hashemish means Bi'at Shimsho. Umayva Taher Gabra. And what does it mean? Taher refers to the Kohen. Two possibilities, Taher Gabra. One, the Kohen is tahor at sunset. That's the original Peshat. That's what Abraham ibn Azra says, as I told you before. Possibility two, which we are adopting in this Sughya for rhetoric, for Melissa, not for content or not for accuracy. Taher Gabra means the next morning you go to the Mikdash and you maybe kaparato. That's Taher Gabra. You bring the final kapara. That makes you completely tahor. And that's what we're saying is the real meaning of Taher Gabra. How do I know that? I don't. At this point, we don't know that. We know that from Rabba Rab Shelah. Why? Because he makes it an active verb. V'yithar. I told you once v'yitaher. I don't think that's true. I'd read it that way, but that's nif'al. I think it's in ken lema kara v'yithar. The Kohen goes and does a kapara. How do you do that? You go to the mikdash and you bring some animals with you for a korban. Once you bring those and the Kohen accepts them and makes the kapara on you, now you are no longer mehusar kippurim. You're allowed to eat kadashim kalim and you're allowed to la'avod b'mikdash. Okay. Right here, dilma bi'at shimshohu, maybe it's like the original pasuk. Amar Baba Rab Shelah imken lema kera v'yitar. If it meant the kapara tomorrow morning, it should say v'yitar. Obviously, it says v'taher, which is a passive. It's a stative verb. They call it, like I told you before, taher, zaken, haham, shamen, like that. All those that's called stative verbs, or it's a verb that doesn't have an action, but it explains something about who you are or your status. It's a status indicating verb. He is shamen, he's fat. She is zekena, she's old. You are haham, right? You are tepesh, stupid, right? Any of those things. Okay. Because it says a stative verb, it must be referring to something else. Umayva taher, taher yoma kid amre inshe ya'areb shimsha ve'at yoma. Just like people say in una idioma in Babel, ya'areb shimsha ve'at yoma. That's a dirasha on the pasuk in Hebrew from the Torah from 1300 BC, based on an idiom in Babel in 300 AD. That's Melissa. That's not discovering the Peshat in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu or Yehoshua or Shemuel, Haramati, Obed-Dino. That's a derasha to reinterpret the pasuk to say Taher means Taher Gabra, Taher Yoma. Because we don't like Taher Gabra, because that means the Kohen is Tahor at sunset. And we want to use this pasuk to support Kiryat Shema is at Seto Kochavim, because in our mind now, post Babel, Wub Shoch Becha, the beginning of nighttime is Seta Kochavim. And the only pasuk we could ever find to support Be'ematai Korin et Shema Be'arim, Mishat Seta Kochavim, is this pasuk if we reread it in a new way where Taher Yoma, Taher means Taher Yoma. And therefore, Uba Hashemesh, phase 1, V'taher, phase 2, phase 1, sunset, phase 2, Set HaKochavim. Now the Pasuk fits our current mentality, and it doesn't fit any longer the mentality of Moshe Rabbeinu, Hizkiyahu HaMelech, etc., etc. And we know that. We're reinterpreting the Constitution. That's what Supreme Courts do. That's why we did this. And that's why we did this, even though Masechet Neraim told you, Kapara la me'akeva. Neraim tells you explicitly, and if you don't remember it, review it. And if you can, memorize that Mishnah with the Nagame. Hebi kaparato, ochel bitruma, and then kaparato, ochel bekodashim kali. Right? That's in Neraim. So now, I'll read it one more time just to read it, but now you should know this. This is clear. Is it clear what milita agab orhe kamashmi alan is? It's not to teach you kapara la me'akeva. It's to teach you we have a pasuk that we could use as a support for Misha'at Set HaKochavim. That's the whole purpose of the Sughya. As you see, we biased it twice. We biased it with Mikedeh, so that when you say Bi'at Shimsho, you think Set HaKochavim. That's a projection. And the second time is when you say Uba Hashemesh V'taher, when you hear V'taher, you think Taher Yoma. That's the second projection. All this is reinterpreting the Constitution. It's pure rhetoric. If the Bet Dino Shel Rabbeinu V'Rab Asher did not have authority to reinterpret the Pesukim, then none of this is valid. That's why it's so important for the Bet Dino Shel Rabbi Yosef ibn Meras in Spain, which is Lucena, Cordova Lucena, where we say Rabbeinu V'Rab Asher Sof Hora'ah, but not before. You don't need a Sanhedrin in Eretz Israel adjacent to the Mikdash to have a national court. Most of the dinim in the Talmud Bavli are dinim mufla'im, decided after the destruction of Sanhedrin. During the Sanhedrin, there was only a mahloket about 3 issues between Shammai and Hillel because they never decided that. That's all. And 95% of the Talmud Bavli is about dinim mufla'im. So they were decided after the Chorban. That's the key. That's the Geonic Andalusian key. Without that, you won't understand the Talmud. Okay, so now I'll just read it, and then I'll read quickly the last part, and then we finish. Amar Mor, quoting the Mishnah. Bisha'a she'akohanim nichnasim le'echol b'trumatan. Fine. You have to use the ta'am of ending there because you're ending your quote in Hebrew. Le'echol b'trumatan. Mikedeh. Let's see. When you hear that, Seboraim. Kohanim emad ka'ach le'teruma. But wait a minute. When did the Kohanim eat teruma? Misha'at Set HaKochavim. Okay. The Liktene Misha'at Set HaKochavim. Projection 1. Okay. Milleta agab orche kamash miya'na. The reason that Tanakh formulated like this is to tell us something as a byproduct. Kohanim emad ka'ach lebitruma misha'at Set HaKochavim. Veha kamash miya'na techapara la me'akeva kidtanya uba hashemesh v'taher bi'ad shimsho me'akevato m'le'echol bitruma ve'en kaparato me'akevato m'le'echol bitruma. Yes, we wanted to echo the Sifra because the Sifra was never published at the time Rabbeinu HaKadosh made the Mishnayot. That makes sense. Even though we have Masechet Neraim doesn't teach you what the Sifra exists. It just gives you the law that the Sifra already says, but it's not the Romez to the Sifra. So it doesn't give you a pasuk that you could think about, right? Now we're Romez to the Sifra. Okay. Because it says Misha'a she'hakohanim nichnasin. That points to the pasuk if you know the Sifra. And remember, Chacham Fa'ur tells us all 100 times, Harambam gives you all the sources, but he doesn't write it like a Western book or a work of the Aharonim from Izmir in 1850, which says, oh, the source is X. he uses a phrase that if you are a Talmid Hachamim, you recognize that phrase comes from one of the 4 authorized collections plus the Talmud. When you hear Misha'ah shehakohanim nichnasin, you immediately think, oh, that's the Sifra. Now I know what they're trying to romance to, right? And if you don't know it, you won't get the source. End of story. And then this source is not for you. That's all. Okay, so now, fine. And then the second projection to nail down what we call Taher Yoma, which equals Seta Kochavim. Now that we mentioned the Milita Agaborhe, which is the Sifra, now we know the Pasuk we're talking about. Once we know the Pasuk, we can make the derasha and the Pasuk that we are asserting the Mishnah is making. We understand if you're going to project onto Uba Hashemish v'Taher bi'at shimsho me'akevato, but you could eat it nonetheless after bi'at shimsho. Now we know Uba Hashemish v'Taher. How do you know though that means Seta Kochavim? There's no Pasuk about that. We're projecting. How do you know Uba Hashemish v'Taher is bi'at oro? And my v'Taher, the original Pasuk, must be speaking about Taher Yoma. Dilma bi'at shimshohu my v'Taher Taher Gabra. We're being transparent. Maybe it just means what we always thought it meant. Bi'at shimsho is sunset. Taher is Taher Gabra at sunset. The legal status of the Kohen changes at the same time the astronomical event of sunset occurs. Devarim Pishutim. Why are you going out of your way to twist that? Maybe it's just plain Pishuto Kemashma'o. Amar Abba Rab Shelah. Here's Yeshivat Surah. Here's the official reason why we don't say Taher Gabra. Imken lema kera veyitar. If you wanted to say Taher Gabra, that must refer to the Kappara. Is that the Peshat? No, of course not. He's making a derasha. He's telling Yeshivat Surah is supplying to you the new derasha that no one ever made before, but that the Sanhedrin needs to make, or the Bet Din Hagadol, to create Kiryat Shema Shel Arbin at Seta Kochavim. We don't have that derasha on record, so we're supplying it to you from the yeshiva of the Emoraim. That's all. That's what's happening here. The Emoraim are making a derasha lehalacha. Imken lema kera v'yitar. If that's the case, it should say v'yitar, not v'taher. My v'taher, taher yoma. Because the pasuk said v'taher, it must be Seta Kochavim, which is the second stage of nightfall, as we in Babel all know since the book of Arzra. Kid Amre in She, but he doesn't quote Arzra. He quotes Kid Amre in She to tell us this is the popular understanding. We are projecting that onto the pasuk. Kid Amre in She. That's why he doesn't cite to Arzra. It would be more authoritative, but he doesn't tell you the information. Kid Amre in She, like everybody in Babel says, Ya'areb Shimsha. They use the term tahor. Adke means tahor. The taher yoma is exactly the adke yoman aramit. Adke yoman aramit is 100% the same thing as taher yoma. The taher yoma. Now we understand. If you just quote, if you cited to the pasuk in Arzra, but Tosefta does, you wouldn't have this the adke. We are trying to superimpose a new meaning on the Taher, that namely Taher Yoma. We have it right here, the Adke Yoma. What's the problem? No es más de una idioma. Una idioma de la gente de Babel is not an authoritative source. Who makes it authoritative? Rabba Barab Shelah, because he is Doresh Uba Hashemish v'Taher to fit exactly the Kid Amre in She. Who has the authority? Yeshivat Surah. And then if Rabbena v'Rab Asher endorse it. Did they endorse it? Yes. How do I know? Because the editor of the Pasuk, and I'll get to you in a second, Elias, the editor of the Pasuk, of the Sughya, adds on the same discussion from Eretz Yisrael, and then doesn't put doesn't cite any rejection or mahloket about it. Here, let me read it, and then we'll get to your question, then we'll finish. So here's the editor of the Sughya. People call that the Setam of the Gemara. This was added at the Kala of Rab Asher. Now, in the West, in Yeshivat Tebaria, this Imra of Rabba Barab Shelah, either they didn't know it, but more precisely, they did not accept it. La Shamia Le or La Shamia Lehu. How do I know? They, the yeshiva as a group, La Shamia Lehu, they did not accept it. It could mean they didn't know it, but it's less likely. Why? The Hachamim traveled between Eretz Israel and Babel. And the Torah Eretz Israel was brought to Babel, and the Torah Babel brought back to Israel by people called the Nehota'eh. Have you ever heard of that? And that's Aramite for those who descended, los que descendieron, the people who go down. Because you leave Eretz Israel, that's called Yerida. Okay, fine. The Nehota'eh most often came to Surah. The bridge between, or the import-export for Torah location was Surah. Surah imported and exported the Torah to and from Eretz Israel. It's unlikely they did not know Rabba Barab Shelah. It's more likely they didn't accept it because, Senor, you want to make a derasha based on what the Goyim and the Jews, but on an idiom in Babylonian Aramite, no thank you. That's not enough samchut. That's not enough for us. We don't buy it. So, so they asked Ba'aya ab initio, even though they heard of his Imra. What does a Ba'aya mean? Ba'aya is a formal question presented to the yeshiva where you, the Mib'eh, assert by asking it as a ba'aya. When you use the word ba'aya, that's a technical term, you're telling the yeshiva, I researched it, and there is no machriya to side A or side B. Side A and B are equal. That's what I'm asking the ba'aya. That means there's no baraita, no mishnah, and no authoritative source, which is another way of saying to those in the audience who know about Rabba Barab Shelah, that's not authoritative. Okay? In the pasuk, could bi'at Hashem, could it mean bi'at oro? And therefore taher must be taher yoma. You always put the new interpretation first, and then you say, or maybe it's the old one, right? And then you negate the or maybe. That's common rhetorical structure in the Sifra, and the Sifra is very common. If you want, I'll find some examples for you. Okay, so now. Hi, Uba Hashemesh bi'at orohum. Umay v'taher taher yoma. O dilma bi'at shimshohu. Umay v'taher taher gabra. That was the ba'aya. Later, the ba'aya was nifsheta. When it was introduced in Eretz Israel, there was no answer. Later, they found a baraita which was machriya. At the time the ba'eh asked, there was no hachra. But later, they found a baraita. Where did they find it? In the Tosefta. And we're going to see, we're quoting it here, but we're also going to be involved with it in the next sugya. Because it says in the baraita, because the baraita uses the term seta kochavim to answer the question, this assumption they made in Surah, and this assumption we're making here, the Ba'eh, when he says, Bi'at orohu v'taher yoma, that's correct. because that is opposite. That agrees with the Baraita, and the Baraita has authority. Shema mina, therefore, there's no question about it. Bi'at orohum, ma'ila taher, taher yoma. So based on the Baraita, we are making this dirasha, and we don't know the full dirasha from Tevaria, but we know the full dirasha from Surah. So if you take the rhetoric of Surah, which is transparent, it says, I'm making a projection. I'm just assuming that. We're not even investigating. We're assuming it. Therefore, we're assuming Taher Yoma. And I know it contradicts the Peshat. Anybody who knows the Peshat, anybody who thinks like Abraham ibn Azra, and he's right, you know I'm telling you a derasha. But that's the derasha that the Beit Din Hagadol has to make to support the Mishnah. That's the rhetoric comes from Surah, based on the point from the Sifra. That's why we Milita Gaborhe is the rhetoric, not the law of Kapara Lam Ya'akeva. And when you get to Eretz Israel, you say, but how does it work if you don't buy this rhetoric of Tid Amre Inshe, which is weak? Because the Tosefta says so. And the Tosefta has authority, whether you like the rhetoric or not. And it cites to Sefer Azra. It's authoritative. We accept the Tosefta as authoritative. Not everything in the book that we have Tosefta, if you buy the book, but the halachot from the Tosefta that are cited to in the Mora'itic Yeshivot, like this one, that is authoritative. For Harambam, the Tosefta is authoritative if it's cited to in the Babli and not disagreed with, not nidhet. Like the case here, there's no dihuya at all. We say, Siman davar sada behadar pashtullaha mibarata. Lifshot ba'aya is a formal act of the whole yeshiva. If the yeshiva means the Rosh Yeshiva and the yeshiva, it says pashtu, that's plural. That means the whole yeshiva agreed with, or majority agreed with the Rosh Yeshiva, and they passed the law as binding. It means biat oro, and therefore, taher yoma. Okay, and I'll have that one question, and then we're done. What was the question?
Yeah, so I have many questions.
Yes.
The first one, I was reading about from Faur, and here is saying Be'adar Pashetu is the same word as Peshat. So the Moraim wanted to say this is a new Peshat because this is is a common understanding of this pasuk.
No. Peshat, so Peshat means two things. It really means to spread out. Lehafshit, like hefshet v'nituach in the Avodah of the Ben HaMikdash, you slaughter an animal and then you take off its skin and you separate its limbs. That's called hefshet. You spread it out. Okay. Peshat means something that's spread out, like nit pashet bechol Yisrael, minhag shnit pashet bechol Yisrael kezinu, right? Okay. In terms of semantics, if Am Yisrael reads a pasuk, and the common meaning, what Vico calls sensus communis, that's peshat. In the technical terminology of the Emoraim, though, of the Talmud, peshat means to, in the phrase en mikra yoseh mideh peshuto, that's the first meaning of peshat that I just told you. But in the context of a ba'aya la nifsheta, or vehadar pashtu laha barata, that's a technical term to resolve a ba'aya, lehachriya, one of the sides. It has nothing to do with peshat in the first sense.
Okay. And in Ma'araba, they didn't accept the how was resolved the Sughya on Surah, but the Maskana is the same. They are
Yes.
only discussing which is the best rhetoric to give the Maskana.
We're discussing, so both pieces have a ma'ala. Surah has the rhetoric. So if you read Surah, you now know the derasha that is required to support Kiryat Shema Shel Arbin at Seta Kochavim. but you may have a problem with the authority. One has better rhetoric, one has better samchut. Surah gives you the rhetoric, but tells you it's rhetoric. And Tebariah gives you the samchut. Oh, we have the Tosefta. Together, it tells you the whole story. And the fact that both yeshivot came to the same legal conclusion means that's the point of law that we all adopt. That's why Harambam tells you from Seta Kochavim.
Okay.
Chacham, I have a question.
Yes.
When the yeshiva in Eretz Israel passed to law, they established that law for themselves, or what was their authority?
At the time, each yeshiva had only jurisdiction over its own area.
Like a local bedin.
That's right. Why? Because we didn't have national jurisdiction in Babel until Rabbeinu Verab Asher made Kalot, and they invited everybody. And here's the key, and you can read this in Horizontal Society. In the year 370 AD, the Roman Empire decided to make Christianity the state religion. That means you're supposed to be a Christian, but if you're a Jew, you could get a minority status, maybe more rights, less rights. Sometimes the Christians wanted to forcibly convert the Jews and the government would look the other way. Like in Australia, the Muslims want to kill all the Jews. That's the truth. And they've put a show on about protests and free Palestine and gays for Palestine, like a gay would live 1 second in Palestine if they knew who he was, right? So it's all shtuyot. It's all tov vara. So that's the truth. And the government really looks the other way until there's a significant murder, and then they have to make a show. Okay, so Roman Palestine after 370 was like that, even before it, right? Because you don't make this law by who was it? Justinian? Constantine the Great made that rule overnight. You make it because the Christians are pushing and they have Yadam al Ha'alyona, etc. When that happened, the Hachamim from Eretz Israel, en masse, means all of them, most vast majority, traveled to Babel, and they brought the archives of the yeshiva from Eretz Israel, from Tiberias, to Babel. That's, if you want to know the details, that's Yehayam number 187, the famous super commentary of Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazan, without whom we wouldn't know any of this, without whom Faur wouldn't have known any of this, okay? So now, once that happened, the demographics of Babel ended up being more than 80% of all the Jews on earth lived in Babel. We have the demographics. We have the majority of Am Yisrael. The Bedin now of Rabbeinu Verab Asher that the Kalot embodied is not a local Bedin, but a national Bedin. So in this Sughya, we're still operating at the local Batedi. The fact that we put the two together, that happened at the Kalot. And that's why you have Sitam comments like B'ma'arva, Hadraba, Barab Shalal Shami Alahu, Ba'ulaha, Ba'ayat, B'hadar, Pashtula, B'baraita. That was local, but we accept it as national. Only when we put the two together are you hearing the conclusion of the Bedinot Shel Rabbeinu Verab Asher. That's how we know.
Okay, so when they were a local bedin, they had the jurisdiction to do a derasha and to do a din mufla too, or only when they were a national bedin?
They did have it. Why? Because when we say Rab Asher ve'Rabbeinu sof hora'ah, prior to Rabbeinu Verab Asher, everybody had hora'ah. So Eretz Israel still had the semicha of the original Sanhedrin. In Babel, no, but in Eretz Israel, yes. That's why we deferred to Eretz Israel. That's why Rabbi Yochanan we accepted in Babel more than Rabbi Yochanan accepting Rabbi Shimon.
So they could do, even they were only local bedin, they could do דינים מופלאים.
They're proposing it, and they could adopt it for their local place. Because in din mufla, you don't know what the halacha is. So what are we going to do? So your local bedin says, do X. Like Rabbi Yosef HaGilili says, you could eat milk after chicken. So for his bedin, okay. But in your bedin, maybe it's no. Then, this helps. It's a good question because now you understand the historical background of the kalot of Rab Asher. Rab Asher said, we're not so far up till now, we let local batei din legislate for their local areas. And that's the whole notion of mareh de atra. So in Surah, Rab is the mareh de atra. And in Nehar De'ah, Shemuel is the mareh de atra. And they could disagree and we do different things. We hoped we would have a Sanhedrin again. Guess what, says Rab Asher? We're not going to have a Sanhedrin for centuries. We see it coming. There's going to be a political shift in the Babylonian world, which was Persia and Babylonia together. Babel was both what we call Iran and Iraq. I see it. It's not going to get resolved. And the Romans are on the other side of the river Orontes. We can't even travel there. So what are we going to do? We need to make a local bedin in Babel, which is national, and that's the kalot. And we invite everybody to show up and everybody to express their opinion. And if you don't think we have authority based on demographics, guess what? We have the Resh Galuta approving the kalot and in attendance with his whole family. He had his own bedin. The fact that the Resh Galuta showed up, and if you read the Hakdamat of the Mishneh Torah, the Rashi Galuyot were in attendance. We have demographics, we have the Melech, he functions as a Melech, and we have national jurisdiction because of who we are. That's enough, that's the authority. You don't like it, Mr. Tosafot, you don't understand the fundamentals of rabbinic jurisprudence. That's why the Talmud Bavli has the authority. I don't care what the conservatives say or the Machon Shiloh or blah, 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 blah. We had national authority. If you're Sephardi, especially old Sepharad, that's leche de mamita. Nobody disputes that. Of course we had authority. What do you think the Resh Galuta was doing there? Just visiting?
Chacham, I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a difference in the faculty of legislation between the Sanhedrin in Lishkat HaGazit and Rabina, Rab Asher, and all that people in the Kalot that they made the Sofara?
Yes, but not as regards national law, as regards implementing certain punishments. So I don't care how strong the Bet Dino Shel Rabbeinu Rab Asher was, they can't execute anybody. Now the Melech could, because he is not subject to the constitutional criminal laws of the Bet Din Hagadol or the Sanhedrin. The Melech, just like in the times of the Sanhedrin, the Melech had his own court, and he did not have to follow Al Pi Shinaim Edim. All this, we say that's part of the judiciary. The Melech has his own rules. And also, the Sanhedrin in the time of Lishkat HaGazit could legislate about Kohanim, although the primary jurisdiction was the Bet Dinam Shel HaKohanim. They had their own Bedin in the Mikdash. And I think about Yehos Kohanim, whether the Yehos was in question, that was decided primarily by the Bet Dinam Shel HaKohanim. But I think the Bet Din of the Sanhedrin maybe had parallel jurisdiction, I'm not sure. So punishments, onshin, and things like that, I think they had sole jurisdiction. And it's a very good question, and I don't know the whole list of differences, but as regards a national law and a din mufla about that law, yes, the Bedin Shel Rabbeinu Rab Asher still had hora'ah, and therefore they had the power. The whole mahloket in Spain was, do the Geonim have authority? Our answer, no. That's why, you see, because that was in Andalusia, the Teshuvot HaGeonim, which they had in writing, but often bad Girsaot, that were known in France and Germany. First of all, the Girsa is often incorrect. And sometimes they say it's a Gaon from Babel, and they really mean a Gaon from France. Especially these Teshuvot that say, for Hosa'ah, the Melach al Hosa'ah and Shabbat requires Shishim Ribo to be Rishut HaRabim. There was no place on earth in Roman Palestine when they invented the Melacha of Hosa'ah that had Shishim Ribo. No place, didn't exist. So that so-called Teshuvah of the Geonim is from France. They just didn't want to keep the mitzvah, the Melacha. They wanted to get rid of it. Oh, I get it. Why don't you be more honest? Oh, we can't do it. It's too hard. Okay, fine, better. Maybe if you say, I need Halal Shabbat, I'm sorry, but my grandson, maybe he'll change, right? Okay, but you didn't do that. So you make fog and fuzzy forever and ever, and all the Aharonim Sephardim are confused. Okay. They accepted the idea that a written source from the Geonim could change the law of the Talmud. So then they got used to the idea that the Talmud is not halacha l'ma'aseh. It's just a theory. So therefore, Rabbeinu Tam could change. Hora Rabbeinu Tam XYZ. Well, you don't have authority. Rabbeinu Rav Asher Sof Hora, not Yeshivat Rashi in France. We in Spain never asserted Hora, never, ever, ever. That may have been part of why Bed Midrashos Shel Rabbi Yosef ibn Mega said the end of Hora, just like it says in the Talmud, is Rabbeinu Rav Asher, not to erase some minhagim promulgated by Rabbi Yehuda Egaon, but to stop this notion of Geonim in France claiming the authority. That's why. So it's not the same, but a very good, you could write a book about the different, what are the real differences in Samchut between Sanhedrin Shel Lishkat HaGazit or Bedino Shel Rabbeinu Rav Asher. Okay.
Can I do a last question? The change about Taher Yoba,
Yes.
was it was a change by the Tanaim or the Moraim? Because we see both yeshivot agree on the law, but they have different sources. So is that reflecting that the change was from the Mishnah itself, or they are projecting this change in the Mishnah?
I think it was the last generation of Tanaim. So, open question. When the Mishnah says, no, sorry. It was the Tanaim. The Mishnah assumes that means Set HaKochavim. Where they got that notion, so that's the law. The derasha on the pasuk may have been contemporary with Rabbeinu HaKadosh, or maybe made a little after, because Rabbi Hiya put it in the Tosefta. So when he says, Siman ladavar set HaKochavim, the question is, when was that said? And I don't know. I think because Haramam tells us, Rabbi Hiya Hibber HaTosefta Leba'er Ulhodiya or Qareh HaMishnah. Is it Qareh or Inyane? Inyane HaMishnah. He's telling you that this was the understanding when they said, Mish'asha Kohanim Nichnasim, they understood that to be Set HaKochavim. So I'm going to change my mind. When Rabbeinu HaKadosh formulated that Mishnah, there was already in their head, it's Set HaKochavim. Did they have this Dirasha already? Maybe not. How do I know that? Because you don't need the Dirasha to have Set HaKochavim or something close. How do I know that? Stay tuned for the next Sughya. Because Rabbi Meir has no Dirasha for his Me'amatai Korin et Shema Be'arim. Misha'ash B'nei Adam Ochlin Pitan Be'arve Shabbatot. There's no pasuk for that. So when they made the law, they changed the law. I mean, they made the new law about the new din mufla called Kiryat Shema. They just said it's going to be at night. It's after Sheki'ah. When? I don't know. Some Tanaim said use this symbol. Some Tanaim said use that symbol. Rabbi Meir would tell you, don't make it talui on astronomy. The Hamon Am doesn't know what Sera Kochavim means. They have to go look at 3 stars. That's why the Emoraim, we're going to see in the first Sughya in Babel, in Masechet Shabbat, they said, forget the sky. Sheloshet Rib'are Mil. Finished. Everybody knows what a meal is. Everybody knows Sheloshet Rib'are. End of story. We're not asking the Hamon Ha'am to be astronomers. Okay? So they had the law. Did every Tanakh care about the Pasuk? No. When did we know that derasha? I don't know, but close. That derasha supports the position of our Mishnah. That's why the Tosefta, which is Miba'er, Inyaneh HaMishnah, has it there, but the next 3 Baraitot have different opinions, which have nothing to do with looking at the stars. That's why they're there. That's why we have the next Sughya. Bear that in mind. So please, I'm not going to study this Sughya again unless you have questions next time, but study the second Sughya, which has 3 Baraitot in it. And also, after that, before we move to Shabbat, I want to go over Rashi and the Girsa of Rashi and how the Geonim, in Osar HaGeonim, how they talk about that, and they point out the correct Girsa, which is the one Fa'ur and I are using here, right? How do I know it's the correct Girsa? From Osar HaGeonim and from Rabbi Yonah ibn Jannah, the greatest grammarian in Spain. And sometimes I read like on Facebook, sometimes I post it in these chats, and I argue with these people. Why do I argue? Because I'm pushing them to say their opinion, because I know it's wrong. I know it's wrong. But if I have to tell my son why we're 1% of the Sephardim and 99% say the opposite, I want him to know the problem in the majority opinion, why the Aharonim, as we say in Brooklyn, are gassed up. And they are, I'm sorry, but they are. And I need to tell my son and my grandson, because he's not going to go read the Mishnah Berurah, he's not going to read the Kaf HaHayim, he's not even going to read the Hezkiah da Silva Peri Hadash. There's no school which will ever teach any of those. So he has to know quickly, without wasting years of his life, why these are errors. So people on chats or Facebook groups will tell you that in Hebrew, it's a valid opinion that there's shorashim of 2 letters or of 1 letter. That's shtuyot. How do I know it's shtuyot? Because David Kamhi and Yonah ibn Jannah and the student of the person who came up with the 2 and 1 letter shoresh theory, namely Menachem ibn Saruk, his student is Dunash ibn Labrat. He's the author of Deror Ikra, that spells out his name, Dunash. He himself said, my teacher was wrong, and it's really 3 letters. And that's true. And everybody who studied Semitics knows that. And we have Hod HaMshulash, we have Dunash. We have, who knew his teacher's theory better than anybody. We have Ibn Jannah, and we have David Kamhi, both of whom wrote Sefer Shorashim. They all say it's 3 letters. And there's some other Sefer HaShorashim from southern France, or Provence, also agree with the 3 letters. That's true. So when people on Facebook or chats, they say, oh no, it's a valid theory. No, it's not. You have to modeh al ha'emet. I know along the way, before we had comparative Semitics by the Sephardim, the Arabic-speaking Sephardim in Spain, I know there were theories, but once we did what we did, we can trust our own Chachamim. You don't have to reject Ibn Jannah because you like some theory that Rashi embraced. Why? You know, I mean, at some point, you have to say, Newton was great, but Einstein knew better. Okay, that's all. So I hope I made this much more clear. What's the rhetoric, what's the legislation, and how I know, and how Rambam knows that Taher Yoma is the new derasha, and therefore it's Seta Kohamim. If you have any questions, you could send them to me in the chats, or I think we should stop now. But if you have questions, send them to me, and I'll answer them. and then prepare the next Sughya, which you're going to see now. It's not so pashut that the setam of Mishnah Aleph is really the only way to formulate. As a matter of fact, there were 5 ways to formulate Me'ematai Kori. All right? Very good. Chodesh Tov U'Mborach. Como decimos in Judeo Español, Hanukkah Alegre. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Gracias, bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Hassan.
Thank you.